Welcome back, and we were having a very interesting conversation before going on to the break, and now we have a very interesting conversation lined up which relates to the climate change, sovereign debt and neoliberal policies, and that too with someone who has lots of feathers to his cap. So United Nations platform is always there, in which people go, people talk, and then there all the talk converts into the actions, right? But there are times when that talk does not convert into the actions. But it's very important to have your voice represented at the global level, especially coming from the global south, with the countries are poorer and they do not have that much of a say in the international system. Shahzad, we were talking about the climate change, about the sovereign debt, and Pakistani state has a very impressive stance on that. So for example, our United Nations and all of these money lenders like IMF, like all of these ADB, Asian Development Bank, they are modeled on the platform after they emerged after the World War II, right?
Yes.
And they reflect the realities of the World War II. And certainly in 21st century, things have changed.
Exactly like United Nations, right?
Yes. And we have a very intrusive sort of a reality, which is a very sharp reality called climate change, right? And last year, Pakistan suffered $40 billion of losses because of the climate change, because of the flooding. Entire system was jammed because of such a huge and a massive level of a flooding. So all of these International Monetary Fund and all of these lenders, they need to change their way of system because their system do not reflect the realities of the climate change. Rather, they reflect the realities of World War II, which was an event that was held in the last century, right? The entire century has changed, and there needs to be conversation surrounding it. So, for example, country like Pakistan, which has a minimal say in the climate change, is suffering the huge brunt because of the climate change policies, right? Because of the climate change realities. In order to have such sort of discussions, we are very glad that we have been joined by someone who happens to be the advisor to the Chancellor of the Greenwich University at Karachi, Ali Jillani. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much for coming to our show.
Assalamu alaikum ji, I hope I'm audible.
Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah. So Ali, it's an honor, Alhamdulillah, for us to, kind of interview you, and Alhamdulillah, you've been honored that you will be actually, in fact, you've been selected as the regional speaker to represent Asia and the Pacific at the high-level political forum as well. And it's wonderful to see Pakistan is doing wonderfully well. But the topics will certainly be around climate change, neoliberal policies, strangulating countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Philippines, and Fiji. First things first, I would want you to kind of let everybody know, because we got in 47 different countries. You have a long bio over here. It's in front of us. We would want you to kind of share your bio and your profile with people first, and then we'll talk about all of this and what are you going to talk about and how it's going to have an impact. Please go ahead.
Gee, thank you very much. I basically represent a policy think tank. It's called Karachi Research Chair, striving for democratization of state and society in Pakistan. We also are part of a regional network, जिसे हम कहते हैं Asia Pacific Regional CSOs Engagement Mechanism. It's a network of about 650 organizations from around 43 countries in Asia and the Pacific. So जो उनका advocacy group है, which basically sets the narrative on development-related issues.
Ali, I'm really sorry, I have to interject, but since we are an English channel, so can you speak in English? So we wanted to reach a broader audience, especially people who are living abroad.
Sure.
Thank you.
My apologies for that. Yeah, sure. I would be more comfortable doing that.
Okay, go
Thank you.
Wonderful.
All right. So I basically represent a policy think tank called Karachi Research Chair, and we are also part of a regional mechanism from around 43 countries in Asia and the Pacific. This network is called Asian Pacific CSOs Engagement Mechanism, and it has about 650 organizations. So I lead the advocacy group of APRSEM, which basically sort of like sets the narrative on development-related issues and our engagement with the United Nations. As far as this particular event is concerned, it's called the High-Level Political Forum of the UN's General Assembly, featuring over 193 member states. Yes. And the main discussion that we have there is around sustainable development goals. 17 of them, and the entire policy landscape across different countries who are member states of the UN is compliant with this global development framework.
Right.
As far as my engagement is concerned, for this year, so they always have this MGOS official session. I will be speaking during that session on July 14th. as a regional speaker representing the entire Asian and the Pacific region, we also have other speakers coming from Africa, Latin America, and Europe, respectively. So some of the issues that I have to cover, first thing first is the sovereign debt issue. You must be familiar with what's going on with the IMF deal as far as Pakistan is concerned.
Yes.
And I mean, similarly, there's been a similar situation in terms of economic crises across Sri Lanka, Philippines, Maldives, Fiji. So I will be, so I'll be representing all of those countries' perspectives there during the conversations during that session, as well as throughout the HLPF. Something that I heard earlier, you were talking about also in terms of sovereign debt issues. You see, 40 out of 43 countries, according to our analysis, suffered unprecedented debt to GDP ratios during COVID-19 because of the economic downturns enforced by the pandemic. However, within the same period, the International Monetary Fund negotiated, I think, 91 loans, 76 of which pushed for further belt-tightening measures. Now, that means cuts to public spending in health, public spending in education, and public spending in social protection floors, and so on and so forth. So that actually means that there was no lesson learned from such a massive catastrophic, situation around the world.
Yes.
And the same policy of business as usual was kind of followed, right? So we are there to challenge those kind of narratives and policies as far as the likes of the IMF and World Trade Organization.
But Ali, I'm so sorry, I have to interject here, but we already see that there is a massive narrative, especially when we talk about the climate change. Already on the front, there are a lot of counter arguments that are coming from the global south, from the country like Pakistan. So we see there was a very impressive representation of Pakistani leadership at Sharm el-Sheikh conference, at the COP conference, and back in few days ago in the France, where our Prime Minister went out there. So there is a counter narrative which has been developing, which has been given by the global south, but we don't see any action in terms of global not curbing all of those emissions, curbing all of those massive industrialization, which is leading to the problem in the first place, right? And when we talk about sustainable development, there is no sustainable development in the West. So how do you make sure that all of these conversations is catapulted into a concrete actions? Yes, we talked about loss and damage fund, loss and damage compensation fund, but I mean at the ground, the conversation never turned into very sustainable actions. So how do you challenge this in the United Nations platform? And of course, there is a lot of criticism on the United Nations that it's a forum just for the talking, right? Because actions are not taken concretely.
So it has always been very intangible.
Yes.
Yeah. As far as I'm concerned and our narrative is concerned, we see that the terms of discussion around development have to be democratized and for good. It doesn't have to be seen as an act of benevolence by Global North, the rich countries club, towards the poor countries. So as far as those terms of discussion are concerned, those terms of engagement around global development are concerned, they are supposed to sort of like change for better. And by that I mean, for instance, one of the issues that I'll be covering there is the official development assistance, which mainly is the key factor that does not translate into financial resources for the global countries in the South. So only, for instance, we have in the Development Assistance Committee over 30 countries as members, and only 6 of them pay only 0.75% of their gross national income as part of the official development assistance, right? And which is why when you don't have the finances, which is called the means of implementation, the Goal 17, then it's very difficult to sort of mobilize change on the ground or to substantiate any kind of efforts in terms of advancing development outcomes, especially across the poor countries around the world. Specifically on the issue of climate change, I think Global South has to substantiate its claim, also in line with the shifting narrative that we are trying to pose, that it's not an act of benevolence, like I said, it's an act of historical responsibility. It's the multinational corporations from the global north, from the rich countries, who have been mainly responsible for the climate degradation across global south. And you will see those patterns even continuing today. So we need to sort of not just challenging it, but also based on the Paris Agreement's principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, we need to come up with concretized, solidarities and plans in terms of our articulation of demands as to what exactly do we need when we say loss and damages fund. What exactly do we need when we say technical and technological support that the developing countries need? And we will be definitely challenging some of those perspectives. And just to add one more issue to that, we are all familiar with what happened in Reykjavik, which was basically a consequence of a very invasive trade agreement that is prevalent in the World Trade Organization's regime. So we will also be challenging that, and I will be using that opportunity, being a Pakistani representing the region, to cite that case as
when you talk about substantiating with the evidence, what do you mean by that? Because there are already a lot of researches which are also pointing out that how multinational corporations or the global north is responsible for all of this mess, which we call climate change in the first place, right? So they're already researches there's already evidence there, but how to convert that into an action is a question mark, right?
And they do not even want to comply to that. And not just that, so you'll be speaking at the United Nations General Assembly session in New York, and you're responsible for all of those developing countries, and to speak about SDGs, imagine that the one thing which is not sustainable in all of these or amongst all of these countries is their economy. So how do you think that we'll be able to build up a narrative where, that this responsible north we were talking about will be able to take up that responsibility and will contribute towards the development? Imagine that we have faced $40 billion of losses even in floods last year as well. So I think that things will change in near future. And do you think that you talking over there, representing so many other countries of such sort where we label them as developing countries, will bring about a change? And do you think that this is the way forward?
I'll give you two examples on this in response to that. The first is, as far as the leadership at the multilateral level is concerned, that is definitely in question, like you said also. One example is that during the very, middle of the pandemic in 2021, I was following a consultation happening in Geneva, which was the ministerial conference of the WTO. And the General Assembly sent a recommendation to WTO's ministerial conference to waive the trade-related intellectual property stipulations. In simple words, that would mean that the countries like Pakistan and others could be transferred the technology so that they could also develop the quality of vaccine like Pfizer, for instance, right? But despite such a pandemic, despite over 76% of the global population not having a single dose of vaccine, the demand was not, so we couldn't substantiate, any action and considerable action that would have had some value for the developing countries, right? So the leadership at the multilateral level is definitely in question. On the question of research, the other example that I want to give you is, so in 1 year, the official development assistance which all the rich countries give to the poor countries, the highest amount that we've had is $185 billion in 2021.
Okay.
But according to some of my colleagues' research, in the same period, we also see that over $2.1 trillion were taken out from developing countries by the rich countries' multinational corporations through tax evasions, profit shifting, asset stealth, and some other invasive instruments like that, including the investor-state dispute settlement, over which Pakistan was slapped with a $5 billion fine during the Reykjavik case. So the narrative we are pushing there is for the United Nations to systematically track these kind of indicators where if those $2.1 trillion are saved in those poor countries, we probably don't even need development aid from the rich countries.
That's true.
Right? Provided if the legal infrastructure is strengthened at the regional as well as global level, and those multinational corporations are held to account for the actions that they do in poorer countries, abusing their weak legal infrastructure.
So does that direct us
towards
some
of the systemic issues that we need to resolve?
So, Mr. Ali, does it direct us towards incompetent leadership over here within our country as well?
Of course, because you see, we do have to have the leadership that is able to articulate its demands with clarity and conviction at the international stage to be able to mobilize the international community and probably lead the voices as well.
Right. One last question, Ari, because we have to wrap it up, which is how can we reform the international monetary lending platforms? Because we have seen that they've often used as a political tool to keep the global south subjugated. So, for example, we can take the case of Pakistan being in for such a long time in a grey list, despite the fact that we complied with all of the points. But still we were kept in a grey list because of the this and that and small things, as compared to a lot of other countries which were actually not even complying with that. There was a lot of money laundering going on inside their states, inside their nations, but there was no response at that, right? So how can we make sure that there is no political tool which is being used to stab the global south or the countries like Pakistan in the first place, and that calls for reforms, right, in the first place?
Yeah. As far as the multilateral level is concerned, I mean, I would say three things here. Number one, to depoliticize. Like you said, there's a lot of political influence going in apparently very neutral international development agencies. You will see a lot of politics going. Even with our current deal, as far as that is concerned, there's a lot of stuff going. And even in FATF, for instance, Pakistan suffered a lot of consequences because of the politics happening at the back, right? So we need to, number one, depoliticize those processes. Number two, we need to democratize those processes. And by that, I mean the increasing corporatocratization of our multilateral processes is very much business as usual, which has led us to where we are, that we couldn't even withstand as a global community a single incident like COVID-19. And the research, the upcoming research shows us that we have already walked into a triple planetary crisis as far as climate change is concerned, and then other several issues as well. So it requires strong leadership at the multilateral level.
Right.
And I think the only way to push it forward is voices, solidarities coming from the global south, not just from the civil society, but also from the intergovernmental level. And perhaps then we can think about democratizing the terms of engagement around, sustainable development or whatever the situation is. Because just to finish quickly, as far as the Asia-Pacific region is concerned, our research shows that we will not be in a position to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which was supposed to be by 2030. We won't be able to achieve them before 2065.
Right.
And I can assure you the situation is similar for the other regions around the world as well.
Right.
So which is why the UN has a lot to think and act.
Thank you so much, Ali, but we're running short on time, and we wish you best of luck for the middle of July, where you'll be speaking at the United Nations General Assembly session in New York. And for everybody who's out there, ladies and gentlemen, may it be COVID, record, may it be the climate change. I think that, when we speak of the current government, obviously Ms. Sherry Rahman has been applauded of what she has done, in terms of climate change for Pakistan. And where we spoke of incompetence with the leadership, I think we really need to go back in time and check for all of those people who were at the helm of affairs and weren't able to do well for Pakistan. And I think it's an eye-opener for everybody out there, and it's a moment of realization. So let's be more rational so that we can take those decisions where the Pakistan is going to progress rather than any other individual. And that's why we firmly believe in the government and the actions which have been taken by the government or the current government, to be very honest.
So until next time, it's a goodbye. Allah Hafiz.
Good morning.
Good morning.